This is the Audi Q3, and it's one of those SUVs which isn't too big, isn't too small, has a posh badge, comes with two different body shapes, and there's even a hardcore performance-focused version. So, does this tick all of the boxes? Is this the premium SUV that you should go for? In this review, we're running through every area of this car, telling you exactly what it's like. But before we start, if you want to see lots more reviews like this, subscribe to our channel and go to whatcar.com to save more than £1,000 on an Audi Q3 right now. The Audi Q3 was first launched back in 2011, and it was a very good premium SUV. This second generation model followed in 2018 and did follow on where the first one left off. Now, this isn't a properly big SUV. The Audi Q5, the Audi Q7 both sit above this car, but it's also not a properly small SUV. The Audi Q2 is significantly smaller than the Q3. So that means that this sits somewhere in the middle, making it a competitor to lots of other rivals like the BMW X1, the Range Rover Evoque and the Volvo XC40. Now, lots of cars in this class just feel like regular hatchbacks behind the wheel, but that isn't the case with the Q3, where you do feel high up off the ground with this slightly lofty driving position. It's not like a proper massive SUV, and an Evoque and an XC40 both do feel a little bit higher, but this definitely doesn't just feel like a regular hatchback, if that's something that's important to you. Now, in terms of quality in here, new Audi interiors, or at least lots of them, aren't as good as old Audi interiors. And when this second generation Q3 was launched back in 2018, that was when the dip in interior quality was beginning to become noticeable. So, it's not all bad. You've got soft touch materials on the dashboard here. The buttons and the dials all are really nicely damped and have a reassuring click and feel to all of them. And it's also great that you've got these physical controls for the air conditioning, because lots of rivals just hide that all in a fiddly touchscreen, which is very difficult and distracting to use while you're driving. So those things are good. And it also has a fairly slick layout, doesn't it? But the bad bits are things like this cheap feeling plastic around the screen here, this big slab of hard, cheap feeling plastic below the climate controls as well. And it just isn't as good as lots of old school Audis that were the generation before this car, which is a shame. But still, compared to modern cars that this is up against now, this definitely does still feel like a cut above a mainstream rival like a Nissan Qashqai, but it is not as plush as an XC40 or an Evoque. The technology in here is impressive though. So every Q3 gets a 10.1-inch touchscreen infotainment system, and this is a very familiar Audi layout now. It's relatively intuitive. There are a lot of menus and sub-menus though. Most importantly, you get wireless Apple CarPlay and wired Android Auto as standard, which is great. And the screen responds promptly to your touch inputs, and it looks pretty good as well. Another great thing is Audi's virtual cockpit, which is their name for the digital driver display that you get. Like with all other Audis, it's configurable, so you can choose what information it shows you. It's big, it's clear, it's easy to see, and it's a great addition to have in the Q3. So what else is in this interior? Well, you have decent sized door bins. You've got a helpful cubby at the bottom of the dashboard here. There's two cup holders, a slot for the key, and under this armrest there's another little bit of storage as well, which is all good. The glove box is also a pretty decent size. And generally, this definitely does feel like a cut above lots of SUV interiors, but it is missing the final layer of polish that you find on better SUV interiors like that of the XC40 and the Evoque. Now, in the back of the Q3, it's really very impressive back here. It's quite a tall car, and so it means headroom is really very good. Legroom as well, also very impressive. So really, you'd have to be an especially tall adult, well over 6 foot, to feel cramped back here. It is very good when it comes to space. Ultimately, an X1 and an XC40 are a bit bigger, but this is still, by class standards, very good indeed. And what really helps the Q3 stand out from its rivals is the fact that with these rear seats, you can slide them forwards, really quite far, and you can slide backwards as well. And on top of that, you can adjust the angle of the backrest, so you can sit a little bit more upright if you'd like, or to help create some extra space in the boot, or you can lean back to feel a little bit of luxury in the back of the Q3. You can also fold down each of those rear seats individually, which is really good because most rivals only let you do it in 2 chunks. But that isn't standard. On the lower trim levels, you've got to pay an extra £125 for the privilege. Still, it's great to have that flexibility. And even with all 3 rear seats upright and in place, the space that you get back here is more than what you find in an XC40, which is a practical SUV. If you go for this plug-in hybrid model though, you get a bit less room than the regular fuel-powered versions of the car because the boot floor is higher. So you can see there's hardly any loading lip at the front, which can be a good thing. You are also still left with enough underfloor storage for the charging cables, which is handy. So even though there's less room in the plug-in hybrid version, it's still a really good boot because it's not that much less. And actually because of the underfloor storage that you get, because there's no loading lip, there are benefits to having it as well. And if you compare this to plug-in hybrid versions of the DS4 and the Cupra Formentor, this is bigger than them. So overall, the boot in the Q3 is a real positive of the car. Now let's talk a bit about the plug-in hybrid because that is the model that we've got on test here. So it is the 45 TFSI E. It gets a 1.4 litre petrol engine plus an electric motor, and it has a combined 242 brake horsepower. And it's fairly quick. It will do 0 to 62 miles per hour in about 7.3 seconds. The claimed range of the car is around 31 miles, which, to be honest, is not particularly impressive by modern plug-in hybrid standards. Lots of other rivals are around that kind of point, but we're now seeing new plug-ins with much longer ranges than what the Q3 offers. And don't forget as well, in the real world, it's going to be more like 20 miles. But the plug-in hybrid isn't the only engine option in the Q3 lineup. There's a lot of choice. There's a 35 TFSI, 40 TFSI, 45 TFSI, and the higher the number, basically, the greater the power. For the diesels, there's a 35 TDI and 40 TDI. We think the entry-level 35 TFSI is really the best fit for this car and the most recommendable one. It's got a 1.5 litre turbocharged petrol engine. It's got plenty of power really. It can feel a little bit strained if it's under hard acceleration, but for the most part, it's a good fit for this car. As standard, you get a 6-speed manual gearbox with that engine, but you can, as an option, get an automatic gearbox, and that auto is standard on the rest of the engines that you go for. To drive, the Q3 is better than a lot of rivals really. It hides its tall stature pretty well. Any body lean that there is well controlled, and it generally does feel pretty agile. It's more composed than an XC40 on a twisty road, that's for sure. But the compromise for this fairly sporty drive is the fact that the ride isn't great. There are essentially 3 different suspension setups you can get with the Q3, and the one that you end up with depends on the trim level and to a certain extent the engine that you go for as well. So entry-level sport trim gets the standard suspension setup, and that is very good. It does a really nice job of ironing out bumps and potholes on the road, and while an Evoque and an XC40 are softer in terms of overall comfort, there really isn't much in it. But S-Line and Black Edition versions of the Q3 have sport suspension as standard, and that makes everything firmer, which doesn't do the ride comfort any favours. You don't get shaken to pieces, but there's definitely a firmer edge, and it's not as comfortable as the standard versions of this car. It's especially noticeable in the plug-in hybrid as well, which is based on the sport suspension setup, but has its own tuning to try and cope with the extra weight of the battery that it's carrying around. And this is probably the least comfortable Q3 in the lineup. Still, the Q3 is a good SUV on the road, and if you do want to buy one of these, which is the best version you should go for? Well, the thing with the Q3 is that it makes most sense when you keep the price down. The pricing across the lineup is broadly similar to the XC40 and the Evoque, but when you start pushing the price up with more powerful engines, higher trim levels, that's when the Evoque and the XC40 become easier to recommend ahead of the Q3. And that is partly down to the fact that they are better in a couple of key areas, like interior quality and also ride comfort. So with the Q3, we would stick with the entry-level 35 TFSI engine, which is the cheapest, but still very good, and it's also the most economical petrol engine in the lineup. A 6-speed manual gearbox is standard with the 35 TFSI, and it's got a pretty slick shift action. For an extra £1,500, you can get an 8-speed automatic, which is also pretty good. Neither is a must-have or a must-avoid, so really, the choice is up to you. For the trims, we would stick with entry-level Sport. It's the cheapest, but it still gets loads of equipment like dual-zone climate control, cruise control, a power-assisted tailgate, LED headlights, and the higher trim levels just send the price jumping up pretty quickly. In terms of options to consider when speccing up your Q3, you've only really got a few packs that you can choose from. The Technology Pack brings a upgraded sound system, a reversing camera and also heated front seats, and that could be worth considering. But the Technology Pack Pro, on the other hand, is far too expensive to recommend. It doesn't really add anything that's especially worth having. By the way, if you like this turbo blue paint colour, then I'm afraid to say it's been discontinued. By the way, as we mentioned at the start, there are other versions of the Q3 that you can buy. There's a Q3 Sportback, which is basically the same as this car, but with a sloping roofline and a slightly smaller boot as a result. And while it has a bit less roof, it actually costs a bit more money, so it's hard to recommend objectively. But if you love the looks and you have the budget, then fair enough. There's also an RS Q3 model, which is a performance-focused version. But while it's quick in a straight line, it's not a fun thing to drive, it's very expensive, and overall, just not very good. So the Audi Q3 has a big boot and a generally spacious interior. It's also pretty agile for a family SUV. Rivals are more comfortable, slightly more plush inside, but this is still a great choice to go for in this class. Thanks for watching this review. If you enjoyed it, give it a like. Tell us in the comments below what you think of the car, and if you want to see another video review, then click over there. If you want to get a big saving on this car and you want to read our extended written review of it, then click on that link to go to whatcar.com.